I'm Cliff Fleet, President and CEO of the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, and welcome to our program, US, Past, Present, and Future. We at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation have a long history of historical education and teaching people about our formation of government. It was embedded in us from the very beginning when John Rockefeller, who founded and funded the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, envisioned this as a place for historical study and inspiration. And we have worked to carry forth that today as we focus on our original mission that the future can learn from the past. We have had to rethink and redo and repurpose ourselves over time as societal needs have changed and we respond to what is going on in our world. And as we have looked at the current situation and where we aspire to be in 2026, which is the nation's 250th anniversary and the Foundation's 100th anniversary, we've identified the need for new programming to help advance our historic mission. We think this programming can be centered around several things. First, we recognize that teaching civics has declined in this country, and we need to refocus and re-energize this as a field of study. Because the study of civics, which we define as the rights and responsibilities or duties of citizens, is critically important in these times. Second, we need to be a leader in teaching civics and teaching about our formations of government and our history. Not to glorify the past, but rather to help people understand why we are where we are today and what we can better do to solve the problems that face us. We also want to make sure that we tackle issues that are of great importance to today, making sure that we find relevance in the past to help us address and solve some of our biggest problems that we face today. We believe that Williamsburg offers an unparalleled platform for this work. Williamsburg was, of course, the capital of the Virginia colony at the time of the American Revolution. And at that time, Virginia was the largest, most prosperous, and arguably most important colony. And it was here, in these streets and in these buildings, that people such as Jefferson, Madison, Randolph, Washington, Lafayette, and others debated, discussed, and formed the structures of government and sparked a revolution. The Declaration, of course, has those immortal words which many Americans know. All men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, which among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those words, of course, were not true for everyone at the time of the American Revolution, but those words sparked revolution around the globe, because at that time, we were born as a nation into a world full of despots, monarchs, and oligopolies. And not only did it spark revolutions around the world, where people sought to achieve those words, it also sparked the aspiration within our own people, so that they could more fully realize the ideals embedded in the Declaration of Independence. Today, we are blessed to live in the oldest democracy in the world. But that democracy must be reinforced and strengthened with civics. Our democracy is only as strong as the citizens who live in this country, and they recognize their rights and responsibilities as citizens. That's why we do this work, and why we believe this program is so important. Our national form of government is, of course, created by the Constitution. Shortly after the Constitution was adopted, the states adopted the Bill of Rights, which is the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Within this Bill of Rights, in the first one, are rights that most Americans know of and hold dear. And these are things like speech, assembly, the right to petition the government, and the freedom of religion. The freedom of religion is something that most Americans hold dear, but is one that people may take for granted. Of course, people came to this country seeking religious freedom. And people have come here and sought freedom in their speech, in their thought, and how they express religion over time. We have a wonderful example and case study of freedom and religion in action right here in Williamsburg, which we believe provides an excellent lesson in this story of American history. First Baptist Church is arguably one of the nation's most important and oldest Black churches in the country. It was founded in 1776 by free and enslaved Blacks. And over time, it became one of the most nationally significant Black churches in the country. We have long worked with this church to tell its history. For example, for many years, really since the 1970s, we have portrayed Gowan Pamphlet, who was the second minister of this church and the first Black person ordained as a minister in this country. We helped restore the bell of this church that was used to open the museum in Washington, D.C. And in early this year, we began a comprehensive archaeological dig of the original church site, which is located within our historic district, with the aspiration that we can rebuild the original church structures in time for their 250th anniversary, which also coincides with our nation's 250th anniversary. So we hope you enjoy this program, which is about freedom, freedom of religion, freedom of expression, and the aspirations of a people to be free in a society that did everything it could to prevent them from being so.
Hello there, and welcome to our very first Us, Past, Present, and Future panel. My name is Jamar Jones. I am a theater and teaching artist based in Central Virginia, and I'm also a member of Colonial Williamsburg's Actor-Interpreter Department, where I have the unique opportunity to research and craft and share the stories of enslaved and free Black people who lived right here in Williamsburg and also around the city during the Revolutionary War period. And today I have the unique pleasure of being your moderator, so I'm looking forward to that. But before we jump into our conversation, I just want to say thank you to all of you for joining us today. These last few weeks, and certainly this past year, have been quite a time for our nation and also our entire world. There have been many unprecedented events that have triggered a lot of emotions and questions and concerns. So we truly value your time and attention to this panel today, and I know and I truly believe that the conversation will be a fruitful one and truly enlightening. So, with that, I think it's time to meet our esteemed panelists for the day, and I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves to you all, starting with Reverend James Ingram.
Good afternoon. I am the Reverend James Ingram. I am a pastor associate at the First Baptist Church, the historic First Baptist Church here in Williamsburg. And also I've had the pleasure to portray a Baptist preacher by the name of Gowan Pamphlet. In fact, Gowan Pamphlet was the founder of the historic First Baptist Church back in 1776, where Gowan Pamphlet and a congregation of a handful of Baptists would head out to a plantation called Green Springs, and they would start to meet as a congregation on Green Springs. By 1781, they had about 200 members. And because of the Battle of Green Springs, they had to move from Green Springs to a place called Raccoon's Chase, right off of the road to Jamestown at the mouth of College Creek. And of course, by 1798, they have been given property by the Cole family, and they will be moving into their first permanent building on Nassau Street, about now 600 members. We believe the largest congregation in the United States of America.
Hi, I'm Connie Matthews Harshaw. I call myself a Virginian. I am a military dependent. My dad retired here at Langley, and so I was educated in the Commonwealth, and I attended middle school and high school here, started college before leaving to get my undergrad and graduate degrees at the University of Maryland, and to become a fellow at the Kennedy School at Harvard. So I am very interested in history, American government, and especially the First Baptist Church, because I am a member. Not the past member. I did not join in 1776. I am a current member of the church, and I've been honored to also become the president of the Let Freedom Ring Foundation. This foundation started after a partnership with Colonial Williamsburg to restore a bell. And that bell is we refer to as the Freedom Bell. That bell was rang by the first African American president of the United States to open the first African American museum in 2016. And when we came back, we brought the bell home. We thought, this church has been here since 1776, the year that our country was founded. There have to be other artifacts, other things of historic significance. So our foundation, the Let Freedom Ring Foundation, we collect, protect, and preserve historic artifacts for this church. And I am very honored to be here today.
And my name is Razi Hashmi. I work in the Office of International Religious Freedom at the U.S. Department of State in Washington, D.C. I focus on South Asia and technology issues. I moved to Virginia a little over a decade ago to pursue a path of public service and diplomacy. My work at the Department of State is really important, as the State Department is an executive branch agency led by a cabinet member, Secretary of State. The State Department leads the work of achieving America's foreign policy goals using diplomacy, advocacy, and a very small amount of money to assist other countries. We advance the interests of the American people, our safety, and economic prosperity. Created in 1789, the State Department is the oldest cabinet agency and is rooted in Virginia's history. The first Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, oversaw a small staff and only 2 diplomatic posts in London and in Paris. Since then, we have grown to more than 273 embassies and consulates around the world. We have more than 70,000 employees globally, which includes career civil service and foreign service officers, as well as contractors, fellows, interns, and locally employed staff, all working for the interests of the American people and our nation. However, in the latter part of the 20th century, the U.S. government reasserted religious freedom as a right and foreign policy priority. It is with this that in 1998, the House and Senate both unanimously passed the International Religious Freedom Act, or IRF Act, signed by President Clinton. It established the Office of International Religious Freedom, or IRF, at the Department of State, and that's where I work.
It truly is a joy to be in all of you all, your presence. So thank you. I'm happy to be here myself. Now, I want to ask you all, this question's for the entire panel, but what does freedom of religion mean to you?
Well, for me, freedom of religion is the freedom to make your own choice, your own conscience, to make that choice of what denomination you want to worship with, what congregation you want to worship with, to be able to freely exercise that religion in your studies, and also to change your mind if you decided you wanted to worship another way or with another religious group. You can do so. True religious freedom means exactly that, the freedom to make your own choice from your own conscience, to make that choice for you and your family and your community, wherever that you may be.
So, of course, in the very literal sense, I think about the rights that we have under the Constitution, and the right to choose what religion to follow and to worship without interference. And it's always been a mystery to me, or confusing to me, of what that looks like through an African American perspective, because there is an Anglo interpretation of the rights that are guaranteed in this country, and we need to be vigilant about making sure that those rights are rights that are understood and interpreted and applied to everyone.
Now, for me, we have to look at contextualizing it abroad. So in the aftermath of World War II, and 3 years after the establishment of the United Nations, the member nations proclaimed in 1948 the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or UDHR, to be a common standard for all peoples and all nations. it set out for the first time the basic principles and universal protection of human rights, including religious freedom. To that effect, Article 18 states, everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right includes freedom to change his or her religion or belief, and freedom either alone or in community with others, and in public or private, to manifest his or her religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship, and observance. It was momentous for that time. It provided a foundation influenced both by the frameworks of the U.S. Constitution and First Amendment rights, as well as the tragedy of the Holocaust and desire to prevent another genocide and mass atrocity. It is through this international framework that the United States had an entry point into religious freedom issues abroad.
Thank you all. Thank you for sharing that. Now, for all of you watching, we're looking forward to answering your questions, so please be sure to post those questions right in the comments, and we'll do our best to answer them, as many as possible. Now, for anyone here in the panel, can you explain to us what is the distinction between religious freedom and religious tolerance?
I'd like to take that,
All right.
stab at that. Religious toleration is the opposite of religious freedom. Religious toleration, and that was practiced back in the 18th century, 17th century, I say before the war, 1776, especially in the 13 colonies. You would have only the choice to worship in one denomination for at least 10 of the 13 colonies, and that would have been the Church of England. Only 2 colonies you could have a choice to worship as you please, and that's Pennsylvania and Rhode Island. It's only because Pennsylvania and Rhode Island had charters that had inserted a couple sentences that said that these colonies will always be colonies of religious liberty, meaning any denomination can exist there, and you as a person in that particular colony can choose that denomination if you want to or not. The rest of the colonies had religious toleration, and that's what it means. We're only going to tolerate you if you follow our rules, and sometimes the rules are very, very strict. For the at least 10 of the 13 colonies, even Virginia, you would have to, as a Baptist preacher, Methodist preacher, Presbyterian, Quaker, Dunker, Lutheran, Amish, Mennonite, Moravian, you would have to first obtain the license of that particular colony to preach in that colony, and that's just to preach. If you wanted a meeting house, you would have to go back in that same courthouse to ask for each meeting house to be approved by the state government, because you see, church and state is the same, no separation of church and state until much later, of course, after the War of Independence. And so religious freedom is that, as I say, that choice of being able to make that choice consciously for your own perspective.
And I'd like to take the view of what that looks like. For me, tolerance to me just says that it's absence of understanding. You have to really understand, honor, respect the freedom of choice of religion. And to me, that the words are just as powerful as Reverend Ingram just said. Tolerance, to me, just implies you're tolerating it. There's no celebration, there's no understanding, there's no respect, there's no honor. And I think that if we are really going to realize the freedom of religion in this country that is so diverse, we have got to understand all of the different religions, how we celebrate and respect them, and show as an example to the rest of the world.
And it's really just the minimum threshold at which we're operating to engage one another. What we hope to aspire, not only ourselves, but other countries, is to focus on mutual respect for each other's beliefs or no belief. And we hope to really elevate the discussion to focus on respect. And as my boss would often say, we would encourage people to really focus out of love for one another, that you wouldn't offend one another based on your love for that other individual.
Yes, thank you all for that. I know you all kind of touched on it a little bit, but can you speak to how this distinction has been applied differently to different groups of people, whether that be in the past or as we might see today?
Again, I can speak mostly in the past. Today we have freedom of religion, especially in the United States, because of the Constitution said so. We have a law now that said we have the freedom to worship as we please by the freedom of religion, and of course the wall of separation of church and state. Before that existed, again, these toleration acts, and these were actually laws, in this case, passed in England. The Toleration Act of 1667, 1665. Those toleration acts were passed in England because of the murdering of Catholics just outright in the streets of London and other places in England, and to try to stop some of the persecution of not only Catholics, but Quakers, and of course that's why the Pilgrims left, because of their persecution. And you did have Baptists in England and other denominations in England that were persecuted. So these toleration acts had to be passed to stop or try to lower some of the outright killing of people because of their religious beliefs.
And can I ask, this is a great question from Nancy. How is religion defined by law?
Well, in this case, as far as the Constitution is concerned, that it means all religious groups. We've gotten somewhere kind of off the mark in believing that the freedom of religion is only for our religious group, whether it be Christian or whether it be Islamic or whether it be Hindu. We sort of want to isolate our own religious belief to believe we're the only one that can have religious freedom. No, religious freedom is exactly what it means for all religions throughout the world. And in the United States, we have the representation of those religions right in the United States.
Thank you. Thank you, James. Now, in our next segment, we will talk more specifically about the First Baptist Church. But first, we want to share with you a clip of Stephen Seals and Jack Gary talking about the archaeological work being done at the site of the church.
So glad to have you here with us today. If you would please just tell us your name and what you do here at the foundation.
I'm Jack Gary. I'm the Director of Archaeology for the Foundation. So I manage our massive collection of materials that we've recovered from almost 100 years of excavation, plus direct the current excavations that are going on at a couple different sites around town right now.
So let's talk about some of the current excavations that you're doing. Tell me a little bit about the excavation at the First Baptist Church site on Nassau Street.
We started taking a look at the site of First Baptist Church in 2020. Now, this is the site that we believe is the earliest permanent structure for the church. That structure was demolished in 1834 by a tornado, and that was replaced by a brick structure, which stood until 1955. Colonial Williamsburg then acquired that and removed that structure, and a parking lot has been in its place. We don't know that much about this site, about the early history of that site, of where the congregation began to meet in town. What was their structure like? What was the landscape like around this structure? Were people buried there on this site? So we're using archaeology right now to try and answer some of those really basic questions. Can we get enough information to understand their earliest building so that we could reconstruct it and use it as a place to interpret their history? Are there burials there? And we have determined that there is at least one and probably multiple burials at this site. How do we best commemorate those burials? How do we memorialize those people? And who are these people? That's another question. And I think a really important part of this project, of the excavation, is that we're taking our cues from the congregation. This is the church's project. We as archaeologists have a very special set of skills. All right? And those skills can be brought to bear to answer questions that the congregation has. Yeah, we have our questions too, but this is about their questions. And so that's a really important part of this project, is that we're taking our cues, taking our direction, and we're working in partnership with the church to try and answer these questions. And together, it's together we're going to come up with the best way to interpret this site, the best way to memorialize the people that are there, and to understand who they were. So that's one of the real powers of this project, is to bring these entities together, bring these communities together.
Is there any last thing that you would want to say, or that you'd want people to know, as this archaeology is going to be continuing to happen in front of us?
Yeah, I think one thing, when I think about this project and the history of the church, it's a history that I think is rooted, like a lot of the history of pursuits of religious freedom, it's rooted in courage. And I think with this church, it's doubly so. We have a congregation, a group of people that are convening in defiance of the Anglican Church, but these are also many of these people are enslaved, and certainly they're doing it in defiance of their masters as well. And the power of the church and the creation of this community, that defies all of those things. And so how do we see that archaeologically? I'm not sure. I think it gets back to just being able to put it all together and everyone stand on the site, look at these things, and start to just have that tangible connection with the past. And I guess I'll close with an artifact that we found that I often point out, which I find to be very powerful. And it's an inkwell, or an ink bottle. And a glass ink bottle. It held ink. The manufacturing technique tells us that it was made in the mid-19th century. And so we find these all over town. Ink bottles are pretty common in Williamsburg. However, when we put it in the context of the church, that takes on a different meaning, I think. And you ask the question, what's it doing at the church? What is that ink being used for at the church? Well, we know in the 19th century that the church is holding classes for the congregation. They're educating their own congregation in there. So is this associated with the education of these people in the mid-19th century? Is it ink that's writing down the deaths, the births, the marriages, the baptisms of this church? Of course, we can't say for certain if it is or not. But when we look at it with that lens, and we show that to our guests, and we ask them to start thinking about that, a very simple, mundane object takes on a whole new meaning, and it connects us back to that community that was there. So I find that one a very powerful object to try and convey that.
Wow, it's amazing. Thank you for sitting here and talking with me about this project. I am unbelievably excited to see what you all find as the dig continues. So just thank you again for being a part of this.
Yeah, my pleasure. It's an honor. It's an honor to do it.
Continue the conversation with Connie, who will speak a little bit about First Baptist Church, the history, and its significance to religious freedom.
Well, this is one of the most exciting and important projects that I've worked on, not just being a member of the church, but also being the president of the foundation and working with Colonial Williamsburg on a site that I first encountered with one plaque on a piece of green grass that said that this was the site of a church organized in 1776. Well, we all know that that year rings a bell, and I thought I need to know a little bit more about this as a student and also as a member. So the history of this church, African Americans enslaved and free, organized to worship, and at the Green Spring Plantation. They moved from the plantation to Raccoon Chase, which was basically a hunting ground. They thought it was safer, but it wasn't. But because they were forced to worship in secret, it did offer them a safe place to express and demonstrate their faith. We understand that a townsman, a white townsman, Jesse Cole, took a ride through, and he was so compelled by what he saw and the expressions of faith by these people who had the least in this country to be happy and to celebrate about. He was so compelled that he donated a spot on Nassau Street. We refer to that as Lot M here in Williamsburg, where they built a church. And that church stayed there until the middle of the 20th century. And we are still worshiping 244 years later at that site on Scotland Street.
Wow. Now, can you speak to our audience a little bit about the why of it all? The why now? Why are we really exploring and really getting into the roots of the history of this church? And also, why is it so important to continue this conversation about First Baptist Church, and what are the effects of the history as we continue to move forward?
Well, it's important because this is not just African American history. This is a history of a time and a place when in colonial Williamsburg, it was 52% African American and 48% white. Something happened here where this town came together, and we were able to, as a community, respect what each was doing, the freedom of religion, the freedom of expression, because slaves were forced to worship with their masters at Bruton Parish, which was an earlier church founded in the 1600s. But they could not express themselves the way that they wanted to in the African sense, what they had brought over from their own country. This is a story that needs to be told because it is American history. This church has survived the Civil War, civil rights, and it still stands and still worships today. And everyone knows that the black church is the center of the community. We do everything, even though there's separation of church and state. We talk politics, we teach our children, we educate our children at a time when you couldn't learn to read or write. The black church was everything. It is one of the earliest churches in the country. And we think that that needs to be a part of the story that's being told in Williamsburg, and certainly integrated into the fabric of everything else that's on the world stage here in Williamsburg.
Thank you. And that's very important that we continue to tell that story today. And speaking of today, Rozzy, this might lead into a question with you. Can you speak to how religion is used to prohibit some rights in other nations today?
So I think before we talk about the challenges, I wanted to kind of give you a lay of the land of my office, the work we do, and kind of the tools at our disposal. So the IRF Act created the position of the Ambassador at Large as the principal advisor to the President and Secretary of State in matters concerning religious freedom. My office at the department is responsible for preparing an annual International Religious Freedom Report to Congress on the state of religious freedom in every country around the world except for ours. You can easily find this report on the State Department website as it's publicly available. The tools that we have granted by Congress are authorities recommending visa denials to designating countries of particular concern for governments who have engaged in or tolerated particularly severe violations of religious freedom. In addition to creating our office, the IRF Act created the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, an independent bipartisan government commission comprised of 9 members, with 3 commissioners each appointed by the President of the United States, Senate, and House of Representatives. It also has similar annual report to Congress, focusing on problem countries and making recommendations. Now, for the challenges, they're systemic. There are governments who overtly favor one religion over another religious interpretation. In some countries, the absence of the rule of law or weak institutions creates a culture of impunity. Authoritarian states seek absolute control over religion and belief. Hatred or discrimination may occur in other countries over longstanding identity differences regarding religious beliefs or ethnicity, culture, language, or other characteristics. These countries may also have a general intolerance or the lack of respect for diversity. Governments' desire for harmony may lead to suppressing alternative views and beliefs, and other governments may perceive that too much religious freedom pose a threat to national security and stability, or lead to sectarian violence or encourage extremism. Some of these governments target members of religious minority groups with discriminatory or draconian legislation that impose jail time, fines, or worse. On a communal level, politicians and religious leaders foment violence exacerbated by disinformation on social media, often resulting in the destruction of property, houses of worship, or violence.
Thank you for that, Rozzy. Now, I want to share a question, and James, Connie, or maybe Rozzy, you all might be able to speak to this, but I'll pass it to Reverend James. This was written in from Jeanette, and it's kind of going back to that idea about First Baptist Church and those first enslaved and free blacks in the community. She was wondering, how did the early black church explain certain scriptures? Such as Ephesians chapter 6, verse 5, slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear, and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Those might even be questions that we ask ourselves today, but I wonder if you all could speak to that from the past and maybe talk about some of your reflections from your 21st century perspective.
Absolutely. I believe, again, one of the ways to try to program or to get one to think the way you want them to think, like the master might want to try to indoctrinate the slave to a particular idea of belief, or even the church or the Church of England in this case wanted you to believe that you were subservient as a slave to all other peoples that were in the colony. So certain scriptures were used out of the Bible, extracted out of context, I say, to make you believe that you had to do certain things in order to be a good slave Christian. But somewhere like First Baptist Church, where a black preacher by the name of Gowan Pamphlet, and Moses before him, William Moses was before Gowan Pamphlet, they will take a different take on how to teach scripture, is to not to extract those scriptures out of context, but to teach holistically the scriptures in this context, in this chapter, and explain to the enslaved person that they are just as much part of the kingdom of God as any other person in the world or in society. They will also use a scripture or maybe a epistle, which is one of the New Testament letters of the Apostle Paul to many of the churches like Corinthians. But in this case, the one I want to focus on is Philemon. If you read Philemon, that Philemon story, the whole epistle, the whole letter to Philemon is talking about a slave named Onesimus. And if you read that it's only about 3 pages, I believe, the whole epistle. Paul gives a little different explanation of Onesimus, the slave, which he believes, since he had been turned into a Christian or Christianized by Paul, that Onesimus needed to be free to serve the Lord instead of serving Philemon, who was his master.
Okay, well, my response won't be nearly as biblically based, but the thing that we struggle with is not understanding the full text of the Bible. And so my grandfather was a preacher, my brother's a preacher, and I constantly challenge them on how do you dissect and take a scripture out and apply it for what you want it to mean, or interpret it in one way or another. So I would just say that to Jeanette, I'm not as familiar with Ephesians as I probably should be, Reverend Ingram. But I think that what we want to do is understand the Bible as a whole. And I think immediately about, being forced to watch every Easter the 10 Commandments and Moses freeing the slaves and going into a land of freedom. And so over the 40 years, I just, the Bible, we need to make sure that we understand it the way that we should, all of the scriptures.
Thank you. Now, a question from Barry. Barry asks, How diverse was religious thought in the colonial and revolutionary period? And were there significant numbers of people who followed a religion other than Christianity?
Well, in the colonial period, again, before 1776, and I always use that as the marker because that the War of 1776 was much about bringing about a change of how you even worship. Because before 1776, you did not have a choice of thought. In fact, that's why you were required, in this case by the Church of England, to attend divine service one Sunday at least a month, because your attendance to that particular parish church is to be taught by that priest or by the minister of that church. And basically what they're teaching is from the Book of Common Prayer. And from the Book of Common Prayer, they'll be teaching you also what thus says the king or the Bishop of Canterbury or the Bishop of London, and not necessarily what thus says the Lord. And so there's less chances of having that sort of, I would say, indoctrination. Once the war was, of course, won by this country, we would bring about the Bill of Religious Freedom, and of course make it a law in the Constitution. And of course, I think the added thing that really made it work, the wall of separation of church and state.
And just the mere fact that the Baptist Church was established meant that somebody, some African American, free or enslaved, understood what that freedom of religion meant, what it really was intended for. So I think that the fact that many of the African Americans were forced to worship with their masters at Bruton Parish, which is an Episcopal church, and then they went over, and after that service, they got to have their own service. And that service still survives today and has grown throughout the country.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, for our next segment of the program, we'd like to share some of the images from the First Baptist Church that are preserved right here at the John D. Rockefeller Jr. Library in the Durant Collection. So check it out.
We are coming to you live today from the Archives and Special Collections Reading Room at the John D. Rockefeller Jr. Library of Colonial Williamsburg. The John D. Rockefeller Jr. Rockefeller Library houses rich research collections that support the educational mission of Colonial Williamsburg and serves researchers throughout the world. The library's collections include an extensive visual resources collection that is highlighted by the Albert Durant Photography Collection, as well as images that document the restoration and continuing story of Colonial Williamsburg.
Now, as we look to the future and we think beyond Williamsburg and the rich history that's here, I'd like to send it over to you, Rozzy, and ask about America's idea of religious freedom and how it plays out around the world today.
Absolutely. So in addition to some of the tools that are at our disposal thanks to Congress, we try to engage civil society and religious leaders as often as we engage foreign government counterparts at their embassies in Washington or foreign ministries abroad. Under the leadership of Ambassador Brownback, the Office of International Religious Freedom has raised the profile of religious freedom globally, strengthening and expanding advocacy and impact. In 2018, we hosted a global conference on religious freedom called the Ministerial to Advance Religious Freedom, which has become an annual high-level meeting of senior ministers, prominent faith leaders, and civil society experts. The 2019 ministerial that followed was the largest human rights event ever, bringing together more than 1,000 members of civil society and religious communities, more than 100 governments, and survivors of religious persecution from multiple faith communities and those without religious freedom. And one story that I actually wanted to share with you was that in opportunity at that ministerial, I had a chance to meet a number of survivors. 2019 was a pretty horrific year in which 3 mass-scale attacks occurred across the globe. There were shootings at several synagogues across the United States, Easter Sunday bombings in Sri Lanka, and the Christchurch Mosque shooting in New Zealand. Our office hosted survivors from those horrific attacks and others at the 2019 ministerial. Their stories stood as testimony of their strength of faith, even in the face of such hatred and pain. And their stories motivate our work.
So this, going off of what you're saying, Razi, it makes me wonder about what does religious freedom really mean for us today? Even here in our nation, as we see America continue to become more diverse, both locally in communities and nationally as well, if anyone feels compelled to speak on that.
So I think religious freedom will continue to be a priority for the United States, abroad and at home. America's religious diversity, but also overall diversity, is our strength. There's no other country in the world that has every religion, race, ethnicity, or nationality represented. However, the challenge lies with whether we respect, honor, cherish, and promote that diversity, or if we instead denigrate, divide, and discriminate ourselves. A society is judged on how it treats its minorities, based on the waves of anti-Catholic hostility, anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim sentiment, and more that have plagued our past, and even today, we have a lot of work to do. What I have learned is that we need to see people as people and break bread with one another, because we all want similar things: to have a roof over our head, for our children to be educated, food on the table, and to be taken care of when we're sick. We need to work to build these relationships in more resilient communities, but it begins with getting to know one another.
And a basic understanding and respect for our differences. I don't understand how in this country we have places of worship, places of faith, where people are actually putting bombs. You think about the civil rights era. How do you bomb a church when you believe in a God that loves everybody? How do you take down a sign off of, a church? To me, that is a sacred space. How do you say grace over your meal and pray at night and then go and destroy a church? Any church, not just a Christian church, any church. How do you do that if you really believe in and respect and honor a higher belief?
And that's a powerful sentiment, Connie. I think all of us, as we continue to look at our news feeds, and a lot of times what's so jarring is, wow, oh my goodness, I'm seeing this, and then you can go and talk to a grandparent and say, the grandparent saying, that looked exactly like what I saw. And it's something to really wrap your mind around that. And it also speaks to, we had a question that was written in by Helena, where she asked, are we repeating the past? Now, I do have my thoughts on that, but I'll certainly open the floor for all of you. Any reflections about that?
I think when we're looking at that question, I think we need to try to think of where can we go from here? What can we do to act upon it? And despite the forums that I mentioned about the ministerial raising the profile of religious freedom, challenges certainly remain. The Pew Research Center estimates more than 80% of the world face restrictions of religious freedom or belief, either by government or non-state actors. Governments must speak out and step up on this issue. And we've actually created an alliance of sorts, a literal alliance, the International Religious Freedom or Belief Alliance, which is the first time in history that an international coalition has come together at a national leadership level to advocate for religious freedom around the world, consisting of over 32 countries, launched in February 2020 by the United States. It brings together experts and practitioners and organizations, and has high-level government participation. We hope that forums like these provide an opportunity to move away from the errors of the past.
And I don't think that we are not making progress. I think that what we see now, the romance of the media, which they always portray these images that tend to say that we are repeating the past. But a lot of what is happening, Razi, around the world, a lot of what's happening here in Williamsburg, in the state of Virginia, in the Commonwealth, a lot of these are not making the media. We don't see and celebrate the things. I mean, there's a reason why there are mega churches. There's a reason why. Because people are still faith. They're still inspired by the Word. And whatever religion you seek, the reason why it's now on the front of our radar screens for all of us in the United States and abroad is because we're now very vocal about it. We were not able to do that before because the freedom of religion was not understood to be the freedom of religion.
Now, you all have brought up a lot of great points about the diversity in our communities when it comes to religious freedom, and certainly today a lot of different religious thought. Now, James, I'd like to pose a question to you that was submitted. This question asks, is atheism inherently disadvantaged in a society that actively promotes the freedom of religion?
Oh, I would disagree with that. I would say atheism exists only because of a country or a place that is celebrating religious freedom. Again, my expertise is in the 18th, 17th, 16th century when there were basically only one denomination that ruled people's lives. You could not be an atheist, even if you wanted to be an atheist, because that would not be allowed. You would have to be part of the Church of England in this case, and you're born into it. It's not anything you choose to be a part of. It's by your birth, and you're told how to think and how to worship. And the change will only come about because of the War of 1776 especially, and winning that war, breaking away from the mother country and formulating this country called the United States of America, and of course establishing the freedom of religion and the freedom of choosing and making your choice with your own conscience. Now, of course, you can be an atheist. I had someone in one of my preachments asked me a question when I was portraying Gowan pamphlet. They said, "Well, I've heard you talk about religion. I heard you talk about the Lord and all this. I'm an atheist. How would I fare in your time period?" I said, "Well, you wouldn't exist." I said, "You best thank God that we won the war, that you can now say that."
Well, thank you for that. Now, I want to share a comment that was written from Dorothy, and I think it ties in with a lot of your sentiments with recently that you just shared. Dorothy shared that we need to see people as people and get to know one another, and that really brings it in, doesn't it? And I'd like to say I think this will be a great time just to go around to each of you just to hear some of your final thoughts. You all have given us incredible nuggets, given me some great things to chew on as well. But is there anything that you would love to leave our audience with, or anything that you would like to give them that hopefully they can move forward beyond this conversation, and maybe they can even take some action in their own communities with anything? And I'll open the floor to anyone on the panel for that.
I think I'd like to start by saying that I agree with Dorothea, that we have to get to know everybody. We have to actually spend the time to find out who we are and how different we are. Because if you think about it, we share more, and we have much more in common than we do, and that we're different. And so the more we understand each other, and I'll give you just a simple, practical example. I was a senior executive, and one of my managers would have a tendency to call meetings during Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur. And they said, "Well, okay, tell me again, why am I supposed to not do that?" And I said, "If I have to tell you, then you shouldn't be an executive. Because you need to understand that your religion is not the only religion that bears respect and honor.
true.
So I'm going to pretend you didn't ask me that question, and I'm going to pretend that you still work here.
Yeah.
And I don't expect to ever have to deal with that again, because we have to get to know what each other's religion calls for, and we have to respect it and honor it. And that's the only way I think that we're going to make progress.
Thank you.
And I agree with Connie 100%. I do believe, again, that we have to talk about religion. I think it should be a part of our everyday conversation. And we're not, again, talking about religion or spiritual ideas or thoughts or doctoral differences in our teachings. We're talking about religion because it's been part of society since the beginning of society. And it's sometimes we kind of taboo certain conversations in our households and in our communities, on the workplace, even in our classrooms. We don't allow certain conversations. But I do believe now we need to keep these conversations of religion, not from the standpoint of proselytizing anybody. It's just so important for us to have conversations, talk about religion. It is part of who we are as a people, as human beings, and your differences in it, your likenesses in it, your wanting to learn more about it, and I think we need to do it with love. With love. I mean, I think that's the most important way that we can actually communicate this to one another.
And, you know, getting to know one another, I mean, that's absolutely what we should be doing. Yes, I may be a diplomat, but I'm also a father, a husband, and a huge, huge Marvel comic book fan. So I do come from a multi-faith, multicultural background. I have Catholic grandparents, I have Muslim grandparents, I have a Jewish sister-in-law, I have a brother-in-law who's Bangladeshi, my father is Pakistani, and my wife is Indian. I mean, we couldn't come from, you know, different backgrounds. And while the challenges may be great, we can work to address them together. This work requires us to be honest with our own history of racism, anti-Catholic fervor, anti-Semitism, and Islamophobia. We know that there is more work to be done here at home. We, like all countries, need to work hard to live up to our commitments. We will continue to prioritize advancing religious freedom around the world, and I'm honored to be here today and share how we're practicing it on Religious Freedom Day.
Thank you, thank you. You all are incredible. That's off the record. Well, it's on the record too, I'll say. But unfortunately, you all, that is all the time that we have for our conversation today. But please know that the conversation does not have to end with this panel right here. I think this would be a great time to perhaps go down the road in a socially distant way and talk to a neighbor you've never talked to before, and maybe find out a little bit about their life, and maybe you might even get some insight on their aspects on religious thought or freedom. But with that, once again, I'd like to thank Reverend James Ingram, Connie Harshaw, Razi Hashmi. You all, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and being here. And we're grateful to all of you who are viewing and watching, and for sending in so many great questions and comments. And finally, I'd like to say a special thank you to our donors. This program and others like it really would be impossible without your generous donations of support. And because of you, we are able to share the complete and engaging story of our nation's founding right here in Williamsburg. So we are so glad that you all took the opportunity to participate in this conversation today, and we hope that you'll visit us right here in person safely at Colonial Williamsburg very soon. And please be sure to tune in next month on February 20th for our next Us, Past, Present, and Future. Take care.